Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to our final day of our annual Adam Smith Week, sponsored by the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. I'm Peter Calcano. I'm professor of economics here at the College of Charleston and the director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. The mission of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the understanding of the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. Today's speaker, Dr. Edward Lopez, may be last, but he is certainly not least. And I want to encourage you as we end this week to find our website, check out our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter and our Instagram. We've been recording all the events this week, so if you've missed an event, you'll be able to watch them later. As we close out the week, I want to thank Dr. Maldonado and all of our affiliated faculty, the staff and faculty in the School of Business, and the 9 other centers and organizations that offered events and sponsorships that made Adam Smith Week national this year. I want to thank all of our market process scholars for their participation this week. Melinda Patience, our program assistant, Jenny McCutcheon, our outreach coordinator, for all their hard work and logistics associated with the week's events. And finally, I want to thank all those that provided financial support to our center and allow our programming opportunities. Lord Acton once remarked, "But it is not the popular movement, but the traveling of the minds of men who sit in the seat of Adam Smith that is really serious and worthy of all attention." The scholars we have brought in all this week sit in the seat of Adam Smith. The center provides a variety of programming that, again, I encourage you to find out and research. But one of our main programs is our mentoring program, our Market Process Scholars. And right now, I want to introduce one of our Market Process Scholars, Caroline Greer, to introduce our speaker for today. Caroline.
Hello, and welcome to the final talk of our Adam Smith Week. As Dr. Calcano said, my name is Caroline Greer, and I'm a student in the Market Process Scholar, and I have the honor of introducing our speaker, Dr. Edward Lopez. Dr. Lopez is currently the Professor of Economics, BB&T Distinguished Professor of Capitalism, and Director of the Center of Free Enterprise at Western Carolina University. Dr. Lopez has worked as a staff economist in the US Congress, as a manager of policymaker education at George Mason University's Marketa Center, and as economics program officer at the Institute for Humane Studies. He's also an author of 2 books. The first is The Pursuit of Justice, Law and Economics of Legal Institutions, and Madmen, Intellectuals, and Academic Scribblers. His third book is on the way, arguing that copyists serve beneficial entrepreneurial functions. We are so excited to be ending our series with his talk, Adaptive Innovations as Entrepreneurship. So thank you all for joining, and I will now hand the floor over to Dr. Lopez.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you very much, Pete, my good friend, and congratulations on holding yet another successful Adam Smith Week for something like 14 years in a row now. Fantastic, and I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And thanks for those who are chiming in and live and those who are viewing later. So I thought I would just sort of warm up a little bit and sort of describe the talk title a little bit. Adaptive imitation as entrepreneurship. I think that one way to look at this is as an invitation to you to look for and to find entrepreneurship, that is beneficial economic functions being served, to find that entrepreneurship in unexpected places. Now, in this case, the unexpected place that I'm going to point to is where we oftentimes hear it described as people are stealing ideas. So I'm going to show some examples of that. But basically, in those instances where some people are saying that the other people are stealing ideas, my invitation is look for some entrepreneurship in that other people, in the fact that they're stealing those ideas. We're going to focus on creative goods generally, but fashion design in particular, because that's where a lot of the themes and a lot of the material that arguments are made of over this question, that's where they come to life. That's where they're most vivid. That's where they're easiest to talk about and reference. But it applies also equally to other creative goods industries, if you will, like literature, music, movies, cuisine, performance mediums of many, many types, including magic and opera, including football and the sport of football, stand-up comedy, and so forth and so on. And in all of these mediums, in economics terms, the producer on the producer side, what we might call the creative person or the creative expressionists, the fundamental act that they're engaging is the supply of ideas. The supply of ideas combined and presented in just such a way so that they're valuable, perhaps valuable right in the moment, but also perhaps valuable with over a long duration too. But the point is that we're supplying ideas in these creative goods spaces, and in order and these goods, they all add aesthetic and artistic value to our society and makes our society richer in culture and in creativity and in vibrancy. And for those reasons, these are societal goods. These are cultural goods. They make us richer in society and in culture. And so we would like to have those benefits accrue. And in order for those benefits to accrue, economics says we would like to have the incentive structures aligned well. And to that end, we want to see what is the incentive for creative expressionists to do what they do, to add all this vibrancy to life. And the argument is that copyists are a big deterrent to that. And such a big deterrent that copyists deserve labels like pirates and thieves. And so it turns out technology is going to play a little bit of a role in how I approach this question. But to get things started, let me go ahead and pull up my slides. And you'll see at the outset that the title actually is slightly amended from what I gave in the opening. Adaptive imitation as entrepreneurship, but also with the subtitle, or how I learned to stop worrying and love design copyists. All right, so to get things started, let's look at something familiar. I think you've seen something like this on a screen near you, giving advice and warning that the content that you're about to view is protected by intellectual property law. And there are only certain limited uses that are authorized by that law. And anything outside of those limited uses is illegal and punishable. So there's a reference point here. And this applies to many, many of the mediums that I was talking about, such as music and movies, videos, and so forth. But interestingly, it doesn't apply to others such as cuisine and fashion and football. And we'll talk about some of the interesting ways that is different. So another good common reference point are these takedown notices. These have become a little bit more routine than when they were, than when they started coming out. But the idea here is that the owner of the content can issue a takedown notice to someone else who's using it in a way that the owner deems as an infringement, and then the platform is required by law to take it down. So the burden is put on the downstream user, if you will, of the content, and to show that it is not an infringement in order to get it pushed back up. That's an interesting little dimension in what we're talking about here. But moving on, sometimes it leads to weird outcomes, like there's a novel by Cory Doctorow, a very popular author. And the title of the novel is called Homeland. And the owners of the TV series called Homeland issued a takedown notice, and it was effectuated, and the novel was taken down as an infringement on the TV show. So weird things happen sometimes. Also, we have federal busts as an indicator of this intellectual property being having coverage and also enforcement. This usually is in the form of trademark infringements. Here we have a lot of examples from the news of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection seizing goods that are in violation of intellectual property. Again, that's where a lot of design goods are covered. So for example, logoed merchandise, that's brought in as an intentional misrepresentation of the original. That's a real fake, and that's covered by intellectual property law, and there's a lot of enforcement that goes into that. Now, to move on to the areas that are not covered by intellectual property law, but still have these same sort of dynamics between creative expressionists' incentives and the threat that copyists pose to that, let's move to fashion. And in fashion, we have the industry saying, look, copyists are pirates and we need to stop them. Fashion designers are the originators anyway. They're original and they're artistic, just like paintings of, just like artists of paintings and music and books and movies. Plus, in the U.S., we don't have copyright law, whereas in Canada and the EU they do, and that puts us at a disadvantage. And also, these copyists have an advantage on technology because you can easily just snap the photos and zoom them around the world as soon as the article is shown on the runway. That's just like counterfeiting. We should stop it. And there's a legislative appeal here. So the industry wants it, and here's a designer going to testify in front of Congress and saying, look, they've stolen my DNA. These are thieves here, literally, and we need your help. And so journalism, high journalism has gotten into this discussion as well. And here's a forum in the New York Times over the question, who owns fashion? And that question is led to, well, the design originators own fashion, and therefore, arguments, the design originators need to be, should be covered by copyright. This discussion also has taken place in academia. Here's a paper on the left of the screen from January of 21, just came out last month, saying that design piracy in the United States in the fashion industry is now ripe for copyright extension. Here's a paper in the middle of the screen from a little while ago, maybe 10 years ago, arguing that the cultural depth of fashion designers, and sort of echoing that argument that they warrant intellectual property protection in the way that other artists do. On the right of the screen is a book that came out about 10, 12, 15 years ago, arguing that the proliferation of fashion, the democratization, if you will, the accessibility of fashion, the emergence of fast fashion, to where many more people can participate in current looks and experiment with their own looks and so forth. That whole phenomenon that begins roughly around the year 2000 and forward is threatening the artisanal quality of the luxury segment. And so here's an argument that the high culture in fashion needs to be insulated from the low culture dynamics. And so in some, I think the arguments do fall into economic ones. The creative expressionists are saying that they need copyright as an incentive to stay innovative. There are moral ones, that copyists are thieves, and there are class-based ones. You're destroying high culture. And so what does Congress do? They say, let's do something about that. And there's a bill that's been before Congress a few Congresses in a row. Who knows what will happen at this point now that there's a unified government. But it would, this Innovative Design Protection and Piracy Prevention Act, it's been renamed, by the way. I should update my slide. It's been renamed only to the Innovative Design Protection Act. They took the piracy prevention part out. And it would amend the Copyright Act to protect, quote, the appearance as a whole of apparel designs for 3 years. And it would have a set of penalties and so forth for copyists who are found to infringe on it. Okay, so that's kind of the story up to up to now, where at least in this fashion space, this tension between the incentives to create on the one hand and the threat of copyists on the other hand has really come to this point of let's pass this legislation. And I think that part of it is this reference to the copyists in adverse terms and in terms that actually vilify them. So, you know, as a little bit of a contrast to that, what I'd like to say is maybe we can think of copyists, you know, sort of as in the functions that they serve, and in looking at those functions, perhaps concluding that these terms don't really fit, something else might fit. So let's start with where economics starts, on the basic argument for copyright. Now, what I've said about the incentive to innovate is in a way only kind of half the story, because that incentive of giving the creator the exclusive right, giving that creator the monopoly over that for a period of time, such as the Innovative Design Protection Act would do, that's meant to spur innovation by design originators. On the other hand, however, economics points out there's the trade-off, where it's a classic, if you grant monopoly power, there will be a trade-off of reduced quantity, and that's going to have a deadweight loss to it. And that's going to take away from the contribution that creative people make to society. So when you look at it from this trade-off point of view, we wouldn't want to have too strong of an incentive to innovate, because that would make the trade-off of reduced access unnecessarily large of a trade-off. That would be too much of an access cost if we provided too strong of a legal incentive to innovate. And so that's a classic sort of argument that gets tossed back and forth among economists and legal scholars and so forth. And I think it's important because it adds that one other side of the ledger, if you will, that the industry and the journalists and the academy that I showed you just a moment ago, they're not looking at this other side of the ledger. And it's important to do that, because the more you insulate and protect who we call design originators, the harder you make it for other designers who might use their ideas, the harder you make it for consumers to access those ideas. Now, that's helpful, but it's also very limited too. Excuse me, I wanted to elaborate just a moment on that. Before I get to the point about how it's limited, let me just elaborate and say this innovation access trade-off is a very deeply ingrained concept, at least in American culture. And so if you look to the United States Constitution, this incentive to innovate is embodied there in slightly different terms. And also, if you look at a prominent case in intellectual property law on the bottom of the screen there, the court says, you know, pretty explicitly, look, Congress granted artists an exclusive right to the original expression in their works, thereby giving them a financial incentive to create works to enrich our culture. So again, it's a very deeply ingrained concept, this incentive access trade-off. However, where it's limited is it's only a starting point to any analysis of an actual market where intellectual property law would matter. Leading scholars, William Landis and Richard Posner, in their leading text on this topic, describe the incentive access trade-off as an oversimplification. And so what they mean is you have to do more. You have to treat it as a starting point. So continuing from that starting point and outlining the rest of my talk, what we will do is we say, let's do this thing of finding productive entrepreneurship in unexpected places. Let's do that by looking at the economic function of copying. Let's also recognize that there are many, many diverse forms of copying, and we can't categorize them so easily. Third, when we begin to look at those diverse forms of copying, we begin to appreciate there's more than just the creation of the good itself and the copying of that good happening between the originator and the copyist. The word concrete captures one thing that's happening, and the word cost captures another thing that's happening. I'll show in a moment. And then we might look at this question of what is originality anyway. So let's move on. The economics of entrepreneurship suggests that we can look at some people who are taking an initial undertaking, which proves successful, perhaps an invention, for example, and then other people who establish, who take that idea and establish it in a structure. In this quotation, that structure is called a new firm, so that idea can grow large, and so that idea can become a routine part of what people do. It can scale up, in other words. So to elaborate there, William Baumol, who is the prominent economist I'm quoting from in this screen, continues in saying that though the routine innovations tend to be less dramatic, the routine innovations he's helping us to sort of visualize. There's a large scale, where innovations, if they're happening because things are becoming routinized, compared to the small scale, where if innovation's happening, it's because processes are getting worked out in the first place. And when that happens, when the two work together, they undoubtedly contribute significantly to economic growth. And that's a mirror image of what the court was saying earlier about how creative goods contribute to the culture. Creative innovation also contributes to economic growth. And then to look at how this happens, it's through this subsequent innovation, or this larger scale innovation, is primarily devoted to improvements and enhancing user friendliness. That's an important point. That's going to be an important point in the fashion material that we look at briefly, this enhanced user friendliness. And also the search for new uses of those products, creating markets where markets were not there before. All of which is entrepreneurship. All of which, in the Baumol way of looking at it, comes from the process of larger scale innovators taking the ideas of smaller scale innovators and working with them and recombining them. And so to sum up, this downstream or subsequent use of ideas is innovation that contributes to economic growth, and it does so by improving on existing ideas. This is taking the object we call copying and looking at the facet of it and saying it has these features to it when we look at it through this facet. So a way to sort of visualize it is, although much too much of an oversimplification, I think, but is you think about, these sort of garage tinkerer, an inventor, a small scale entrepreneur, and then what is it would take for that to scale up? Well, it's going to take some adaptation of that small scale invention. It's going to take let's imitate that idea, but we need to adapt it in ways that will allow it to scale up. And the famous Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter describes this process as the carrying out of new combinations, which is different from mere copying. So let's look at a few types of copying. Some of it is mere counterfeiting. This is a fake. There's no if, ands, or buts about it. There's a thriving dark market of counterfeits. Counterfeits have ratings of quality to them. The producers of the counterfeits know how to sort of adjust their business model to create more in higher quality knockoffs when people are demanding them, compared to lower quality knockoffs when demand shifts that direction and so forth. So this is mere counterfeiting. This is not really fitting into the mold of Baumol, because it's not so much a subsequent innovation as much as it is taking advantage of a distributional scale and the ability to misrepresent. Counterfeiting, I would say, fits less into this overall argument. but I do want to recognize it as a form of copying. And so we won't do a fake presentation here. We'll just move on to the forms of copying that I think are a little bit closer to scope. Some copying turns out is legal, but you have to license it. So for example, music covers. Other examples involve licensing across for characters in hero movies. Some copying, coming to the fashion examples, are what you might call sort of a literal translation. On the left, you have a artisanal designed and made dress. And on the right, you have a large corporate knockoff, if you will, of that dress. Is it the same dress? No, it's not a direct copy. I don't think that the large corporate chain would be able to economically supply an exact copy to large numbers of folks at prices that would make sense to them to pay. What do you need to do instead of literally just direct copy across? Is you have to adapt it. You have to adapt it so that it can be produced at large scale at an average cost and a marginal cost that's economical. And so if you notice, it's a literal translation. It's a translation, but it's not an exact copy. And there are some ways that you can detect that are on the screen if you notice enough. There are some seams missing in the right hand, the big scale one. And then if you read about this on the blog, the person who initially posted it, Professor Susan Scafferty, you'll learn that there are other cost advantages built into the example on the right, such as cheaper fabric and assembly line techniques built into it. And so there's a prominent example of how mere copying is one thing, but adaptive imitation is really what we see. So we see that also. Some designers on the left might, for example, target a sort of high price segment. That dress on the left goes for $1,000. The dress on the right, similar overall look. In this case, very sort of strikingly similar, but a different type of garment made through a different process of different material and able to therefore service a different segment at $245. And you have the same types of copying happening from an overall look of a high-end designer on the left hand to an overall look of a budget. This on the right is Walmart girl showing at New York Fashion Week. You have an option to have the same overall look as the one on the left, but at a much lower price point. If you have the perspective of, no, I don't want to participate in that lower price point, you have the option on the left to pay higher and be more exclusive and novel in your fashion. You see also firm-to-firm copying in car design. One thing you'll notice is that the higher-end German models are usually, not usually, but often copied in design elements by the mid-range American and Japanese marks. And here's a couple of examples on the screen there. So it's not just in fashion, it's in design as a whole, where we see this almost cascade effect from design elements that appear in higher market segments and then somehow appear in lower market segments as slight variations, as adapted imitations. This is a very nice example, comes from Film to Fashion. This is a 2007 film. That the gown on the left, which was played an important role in the sort of plot and the theme of the movie, later was auctioned for charity and fetched $46,000. But then, as it says on the screen there, that's the actress Keira Knightley, and the film is Atonement, and that came out in 2007. But soon thereafter, shops where young women go to buy their dresses featured dresses that have the same overall look. Is it the same dress? I don't know $46,000 seems like a lot to pay for a prom dress. But no, it might not be the exact dress, but it has that same sort of general aesthetic statement to it. And here you have, again, the process of adaptation, of routinization, of making the garments both accessible because they're produced in a cost-effective way, but also participatory because they evoke the same look that Keira Knightley had in this endearing and famous movie. And so, one way to sort of sum this up is the segmentation of the marketplace that fashion copying allows gives you the chance, if you wanted to go to shop, say, on the left, or if you wanted to go and shop, say, on the right. I'll come back to that and sort of see how you might look at the options in a moment. So with that in mind and all those various forms of copying, I think it makes sense to now sort of suggest that one thing that design copyists do in the fashion space is they help things move from abstract ideas. Abstract ideas, you might think of Fashion Week in Paris or in New York as the space and the occasion where designers get to experiment, where they get to show and supply garments that make aesthetic statements unconstrained by the need for these garments to be wearable. That's a space where designers can compete with each other on their ability to use their design prowess in garments to make these aesthetic statements. And that's an important space. However, when it comes down to, wearing things to the movies or to your next Zoom call, we got to go to a different space than that. So, one thing that I noticed about this fashion show when it came out, as it was written up in the Wall Street Journal made this point about this is not very wearable and it doesn't appeal to this to sort of regular guy. And there's a quote in there: "There's nothing on the runway that would have any influence over what I wear. Peter Rothschild, some guy from Chicago," right? So let's see, what does Peter have to count on looking at copyists as adaptive imitators? Well, consider a parallel example. Here's a hat that was shown as part of a collection by Carolina Herrera in the late 2000s. And her theme was, I forget exactly, but it involved this several hats that had these 3-foot pheasant feathers attached to them. And, I had never seen one of these on the Metro when I lived in DC. I had never seen one of these on the 101 when I, in somebody's car when I lived in San Francisco. I've never asked somebody in the movie theater, can you please, tilt your 3-foot feather hat to the side so I can see the screen. I've never seen anybody wearing one of these out in the world. But nonetheless, it's an important thing to recognize and to see that even though without the wearability, as I've just shown on the screen there, the designer says this is not about anything, this is about fantasizing. Now, that's very interesting, but it's also not exactly correct. She's not merely fantasizing here. She's setting a reference point. And the reference point is going to be utilized by design copyists. And design copyists will adapt while they imitate. They'll figure out ways to produce the same aesthetic overall look at a low enough cost so that they can present it to the marketplace at a price that people will pay. And what's interesting is that you won't see this exact hat in public in all likelihood. However, you'll see something very similar come out in the stores some time later at affordable prices. so that and with design elements and aesthetics that are influenced by the fantasizers, by the originators. And the guy from Chicago says, I love it when design copyists take us from abstract stuff that I would never consider wearing to the concrete, from the catwalk to the sidewalk. Because I thought that 3-foot hat looked kind of cool. And even though I would never buy it or wear it, something that looks kind of cool in that same way, I most certainly would, and that's going to make me happy. So, think about that some guy from Chicago effect. And, the reaction that a lot of folks have when they observe, Fashion Week, an article on the runway. And the common reaction might be sometimes, oh, who would ever wear that? What is originality anyway? Carolina Herrera have made a fantastic collection there, and highly original. But I think that we might ask, where was her inspiration? And here's a guy named Kirby Ferguson who addresses this issue from not the topic of fashion, but movies and music and some pop culture. And he had a series of short documentaries that he made a few years back called Everything is a Remix. And in this, he takes no prisoners. All of our deeply held cultural geniuses, our creative geniuses, such as George Lucas behind Star Wars, Led Zeppelin in the peak rock and roll era, and Steve Jobs inventing and Apple inventing the Macintosh. All of this was involved, as Kirby Ferguson's documentaries beautifully show and document pretty granularly. All of those creative geniuses were doing the same thing. They were combining elements that had already existed around them, and they were doing so with a new application that meant a lot to people. And so, if you're interested in the details of that, I invite you to go see those short documentaries. I think he still has them up on his sites. But just to sort of punchline it, he concludes them by coming to this famous phrase by Isaac Newton. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. And as Mr. Kirby Ferguson is narrating, he says, which Isaac Newton stole from John of Salisbury. Bernard of Chartres, I should say, used to say that we are like dwarves on the shoulders of giants. So there's another reference point for asking, what is originality anyway? Well, let's come back to Carolina Herrera. What inspired her? I'm a big fan of this man, Steve Martin. And in 1970, I want to say 4, Steve Martin made a movie called The Jerk. And he wore a hat that looked a lot like the hat that Carolina Herrera showed on the runway in 2008. And this movie, if you haven't seen it, is a rags to riches story. And when Steve Martin's character goes from being rags to going riches, one of the first things he does is he buys this fancy suit for himself with a hat that, I haven't seen evidence to the contrary, inspired Carolina's French country collection in 2008. Steve Martin was so excited he bought this Boss Trans Am for himself, and he even bought a feathered hat for his dog, which, if you know the movie, his dog's name is a profanity, so I cannot introduce you to him right now. So what is originality? Here's an interesting point as I get close to wrapping up. In 1928, this book was published. It's called The Economics of Fashion. And it's by a person named Paul Nystrom. And when I was teaching at San Jose State, one of my students walked up to me and said, I think you might like this book. And so it was, I came upon it not spontaneously, but by my student's recommendation. And I find in that book written in 1928, in many spots, it feels like he could have been writing today in our time. And so here, this long quote, I apologize. I won't read the whole thing, but he's saying how there are originators and there are copyists, but the vast majority are the copyists. In the whole globe of apparel design at the time, which consisted of Paris and New York had not yet emerged. So it consisted of Paris with New York as the main copying center, and then the distribution to the rest of the world through copying from there. He says maybe there are 15 originators. The rest of them are, the whole world is getting clothed by the copyists. He also, on the next slide I'll show, this is the, what the other quote I'll give you from Nystrom, is that he just describes it as imitation. Fashion is a widespread adoption by imitation of a style. And so that's an important little nugget right there, because I think that Nystrom, for those of you who might recognize the economist Armin Alchian and some of his work on entrepreneurship as imitation, here's a connecting point where Paul Nystrom anticipates that. And in the papers that I'm writing on these topics, I'm teasing that out some. If you're interested in that, I'd like to hear from you. But I think it's interesting in its own right. He just describes it. Fashion is a widespread adoption by imitation of a style. And so those who look at fashion and say the copyists are harming it, I think that Nystrom is saying, no, the copyists are it. And he continues here that the methods by which fashion spread are the same as those that cause the spread of every new idea. So he's saying it's not just the fashion world. He continues, the use of every invention and convenience of life, whether cash registers, fountain pens, automobiles, it follows the same process, the same spread of ideas and of imitation as in the case of pure style goods or pure fashion goods, as we've been talking about. Interesting point, huh? And so Nystrom talks about how the technologies in 1928 really favor the copyists. You have fast boats that go over the Atlantic in 2 weeks as opposed to 3 or something, I forget the exact durations. People have been talking about technology of the copyists being ahead of the originators for a long time, but I never really was persuaded by that. I think that I think what's wrong with the argument that originators have the same access to technology as the copyists in at any point in time. And here's some interesting anecdotal evidence that sometimes the copyists are that necessity, which to the originators is that mother of invention. And so originators have been experimenting with different types of fabrics that don't lend themselves so easily to the methods and the technologies that the copyists are using. So the originators are fighting back without using intellectual property law to do so. So what is copying? I've talked to you about the movement from the abstract to the concrete. And I've talked to you about the sort of creation of new market segments and the service of those market segments when they wouldn't be otherwise. But what about this choice you might have? You might go and shop for this overall look and buy everything at the high-end designer store and pay $2,190 for the sweater, $1,750 for the belt, $1,190 for the skirt, $1,050 for the boots, for, not too bad, $6,180. You could instead not get the exact articles, but the same, you could participate in the same overall look by getting the sweater for $69 at Banana Republic, the belt for $40 at Forever 21, the boots, you got to splurge a little for $199 at Guess, and then the overall look comes down to $318. So you have that difference, you have that difference in your pocket. That's a choice you have. What is copying? Copying is that increasing participation that I've been mentioning a few times. And it is, it's achieved by what I'm going to show on the next screen, which is kind of my summary. How do we learn to love design copyists? I think we listen to William Baumol and Armin Alchian and Paul Nystrom and others who sit in the seat of Adam Smith. And we recognize by doing so that design copyists are adaptive, imitative innovators. We call those people entrepreneurs. They're adaptive, imitative innovators. They are entrepreneurs because they segment and create new markets by innovating to scale. And I also translate design from abstract to concrete, making it accessible. So I would say, if you're interested in thinking about how this might have policy implications, whereas some of the industry in the fashion world are saying, please, Congress, we need copyright protection. They're stealing our DNA. They're ruining our business models. You know, maybe the point is to say, look, Congress, the whole idea of fashion is to copy. And when we see that these benefits accrue, and it's not just in fashion, because so many things work this way, so that maybe the message that needs to come along is too much copyright would restrict that, would restrict the flow of ideas available to downstream innovators, and would therefore restrict these beneficial entrepreneurial functions. And with that, I have to say, there's a lot about the fashion world that I don't know. There's a lot about the design world that I don't know. There are so many issues and different topics where, you know, this tension between creators and copyists comes into play.